A single thread of knowledge connects the ancient world to your university lecture hall. This story begins with the legendary Library of Alexandria, a place of such immense learning that its destruction was thought to be a permanent end. But its light was never truly extinguished. You will learn the incredible, untold story of how the wisdom of antiquity was saved from oblivion by a hidden chain of scholars. How did ideas from a burned library travel through war and chaos to become the bedrock of modern science and education? Who were the forgotten heroes that carried this flame through the darkest of times? What does it truly mean that our entire system of learning was built on this fragile, unbreakable chain? What do you believe is the most important idea humanity has ever saved from being lost forever? Ships from across the known world docked in Alexandria, their holds carrying a treasure far more valuable than silk or spice. They carried books. Royal agents would meet these ships not to tax their cargo, but to confiscate every scroll on board. The originals were taken directly to the Great Library, meticulously copied by a small army of scribes, and only the copies were returned to the owners. This was the relentless, almost obsessive ambition of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt, to gather every single book in existence. Imagine a single building aiming to hold the entirety of human knowledge. It was the internet of the ancient world, made of papyrus and ink. Within its halls you could find Euclid defining the very rules of geometry, Archimedes calculating pi, and Aristarchus arguing that the earth revolved around the sun. This was not a quiet, dusty archive. It was a buzzing, vibrant university centuries before the word existed. Scholars argued in its gardens, edited texts in its scriptoriums, and performed dissections in its rooms, pushing the boundaries of what was known. The library's true revolution was its method, a systematic, collaborative pursuit of truth that set a standard for all scholarship to come. Its physical destruction, a tragedy mourned for millennia, was only the beginning of a much greater story. For the ideas born there were too powerful to ever be contained by four walls. They had already begun their long, perilous journey into the future. The Roman Empire was cracking, and with it, the unified Greek-speaking world that had sustained the library's legacy began to fracture. But the light of its knowledge did not gutter out. It simply found a new home and a new language in the bustling, scholarly cities of the Near East. Here, Syrian Christians became the unsung heroes of this story. In centers of learning like Edessa and Nisibis, a quiet, intellectual revolution was underway. These scholars looked at the vast treasure of Greek philosophy and science and asked a profound question: how do we make this ours? Their answer was to translate it, word by painstaking word, into their own tongue, Syriac. This was the birth of a new, crucial link in the chain. A man named Sergius of Rhaetia stands as a giant in this effort. He was not a mere copyist. He was a true translator, a physician and philosopher who had to first fully grasp the most complex ideas from texts by Aristotle and the great medical minds. Then he had to find the precise words in Syriac to convey those same intricate concepts. Think of the challenge. How do you translate a term for a philosophical idea that has no direct equivalent in your language? This work demanded deep comprehension and brilliant interpretation. It was an act of preservation through transformation, ensuring the very soul of Greek thought could live outside its original body. These Syriac-speaking communities were often caught in a dangerous political vise, living on the frontier between the warring Byzantine and Persian empires. Yet this position as a cultural buffer became their strength. While empires clashed over territory, these scholars were safeguarding a different kind of territory, the realm of ideas. They protected knowledge not with swords but with pens, preserving it through periods of intense conflict that might otherwise have consumed it. Their work created a stable, intellectual bridge across a divided world. And as they built this bridge, they were unknowingly preparing for its greatest test and its most dramatic expansion into the heart of a new and rising empire. A new empire was rising, one that would forge the next and perhaps most crucial link in the chain. The Abbasid Caliphate moved its capital to the newly founded city of Baghdad in the 8th century, and with breathtaking speed, this city became the new Alexandria. It was a deliberate act of intellectual ambition. The caliphs, particularly the visionary Al-Mamun, poured their vast wealth into a single, world-changing institution, the House of Wisdom. Think of it not as a simple library, but as a massive, state-funded research university and translation bureau combined. Its mission was audacious: to systematically seek out and translate the entire known world's knowledge into Arabic. And where did they find this treasure trove of Greek science and philosophy? It was waiting for them, perfectly preserved in the Syriac translations made by those earlier Christian scholars. The chain had delivered its cargo to the right place at the right time. At the House of Wisdom, translation was a science in itself, perfected by masters like the physician Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He did not simply take a single Syriac text and convert the words. He assembled multiple manuscripts, compared different versions, and worked with a team of assistants to produce a definitive, polished Arabic edition. His translations of the medical works of Galen were so precise and clear that they became the standard texts for centuries. This painstaking process ensured that the core ideas of Aristotle's logic, Plato's philosophy, and Euclid's mathematics were not just preserved, but clarified and strengthened for their next journey. But this was far more than a passive act of preservation. The scholars of Baghdad were active, critical engagers. A brilliant philosopher like Al-Kindi did not just translate Aristotle, he asked new questions of the text. How does Greek logic align with the principles of Islamic theology? How can this ancient wisdom be integrated with the astronomical knowledge from Persia and India? Al-Farabi, known as the second teacher after Aristotle himself, wrote extensive commentaries that expanded upon the original ideas, creating a new, synthetic philosophy that was both Greek and Islamic. They were not merely storing knowledge in a new language, they were heating it in the forge of their own culture, adding to it, and transforming it into something even richer. This period of intense intellectual fusion in Baghdad set the stage for a monumental shift. The knowledge, now amplified and refined, was poised for its most unexpected journey, a return to the continent that had largely forgotten it. Yet this golden age was far more than a vault for old books. It was a vibrant, humming laboratory of the mind, stretching from the sun-drenched courtyards of Cordoba to the bustling markets of Cairo. For centuries, the Islamic world became the undisputed center of global learning, a place where the Greek legacy was not just preserved but profoundly advanced. The translated texts were the starting point, not the finish line. Scholars engaged with them, debated them, and then asked the crucial question, what comes next? This spirit of inquiry had a name, Ijtihad, the practice of independent reasoning. It was an intellectual culture that encouraged questioning ancient authorities and creating new knowledge. In medicine, a Persian scholar named Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, did not simply copy the works of Galen. He synthesized them with his own clinical observations and philosophical insights into a single, monumental text called the Canon of Medicine. This book did not just preserve Greek ideas, it organized and expanded them so masterfully that it became the standard medical textbook in Europe and the Islamic world for over 600 years. Imagine a single volume so comprehensive it defined the very practice of healing for centuries. At the same time, in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi was solving practical problems of inheritance and land distribution. His systematic approach to solving equations was so revolutionary it gave us a new branch of mathematics, algebra, a word derived from the title of his most famous book. He also championed the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the very numbers we use today, which replaced clumsy Roman numerals and made complex calculations possible. This was not merely keeping a flame alive, it was pouring fuel on it. Then there were the philosophers like Ibn Rushd of Andalusia, known as Averroes in Latin. He wrote such meticulous, clear-headed commentaries on the works of Aristotle that when European scholars rediscovered them, they were astounded. They had never encountered Aristotle explained with such logical precision. Ibn Rushd argued that reason and faith were not enemies, but two complementary paths to the same truth, a radical idea that would later ignite intellectual revolutions in the West. The chain of knowledge was no longer just being carried, it was being actively reforged in this immense intellectual workshop, each link made stronger and more intricate by the fusion of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Islamic thought. This enriched and expanded body of knowledge now faced a final, perilous journey, one that would carry it back across a continent that had slumbered through its own dark ages. While empires built their great libraries, another, more resilient network was quietly weaving knowledge into the fabric of the world itself. The Silk Road was far more than a commercial highway for silk and spices. It was a sprawling, decentralized internet of its age, transmitting ideas with every footstep of a camel and every transaction in a dusty market square. This was the informal, organic counterpart to the formal House of Wisdom, and in many ways it was even more crucial to survival. Knowledge was no longer just stored in a single, magnificent city. It was on the move, replicated endlessly across thousands of miles. In the saddlebags of Nestorian Christian merchants, alongside bolts of fine cloth and bags of pungent spices, rode precious manuscripts. These traders, moving along established routes between the Islamic world, India, and China, became the unsung diplomats of the intellect. They carried astronomical tables from Baghdad to be studied in Samarkand, and they transported medical recipes that blended Greek, Persian, and Indian wisdom in the thriving oasis city of Bukhara. Think of the scene in one of these bustling market cities, a crossroads of continents. In a crowded caravanserai, a merchant from Cairo might share a newly acquired map with a scholar from Constantinople, while a traveler from the East describes a novel numeral system observed in India. These were not formal academic conferences, but spontaneous, vital exchanges happening where goods were bartered and stories were told. This constant, low-level circulation of ideas created an incredible resilience. The knowledge of the ancients was no longer a single, flickering flame in one great library, vulnerable to a single disaster. It was now a constellation of countless sparks scattered across the vastness of Asia and Europe. If a caliphate fell into chaos or a city was sacked, the books in its library might burn, but identical copies of those same texts were already safe, traveling with a caravan 1,000 miles away, or being read in a monastery on a different continent. The chain of knowledge had become a web, and a web is far harder to break. This diffusion set the stage for the final, most dramatic leap, as these scattered sparks finally drifted toward a Europe that was slowly stirring from its long intellectual sleep. While empires rose and fell, the chain of knowledge found its most resilient carriers in a people without a kingdom of their own. Scattered across the Muslim and Christian worlds, Jewish communities became the cosmopolitan glue of the intellectual network. They were the ultimate cultural translators, often fluent in the three great languages of learning, Arabic, Hebrew, and the local vernacular of wherever they lived. This multilingual fluency gave them a unique passport across intellectual borders. In the vibrant city of Cordoba, a young Moses ben Maimon, known to history as Maimonides, absorbed the full breadth of Islamic philosophy and science. He did not just read these Arabic texts, he engaged with them on the deepest level, writing his own monumental works on medicine and Jewish law in Judeo-Arabic, a form of Arabic written in Hebrew script. His masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, is a profound synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy, Islamic thought, and Jewish theology, a towering achievement that could only have been born at this crossroads of civilizations. But these scholars were not stationary. Persecution and political upheaval forced constant migrations, and when these learned Jewish families moved, they did not travel light. They carried their most precious possessions, their personal libraries of books and manuscripts. Think of a scholar forced to flee his home, carefully packing scrolls and codices that contained the sum of Greek and Islamic knowledge, carrying that entire world on the backs of mules as he sought refuge in a new land. This movement transformed the Jewish diaspora into a living, breathing, and highly mobile internet. They carried these intellectual treasures with them into the rising urban centers of Christian Europe, particularly into the tolerant atmosphere of Provence in southern France and into the bustling city-states of Italy. There, they began the next crucial phase of the work, translation. In places like Toledo after the Christian reconquest, teams of Jewish scholars, often working alongside Christian clerics, performed a linguistic miracle. They would take a complex Arabic text on astronomy or medicine, translate it orally into a Romance language like Castilian, and then a Christian scribe would translate that spoken version into written Latin. This three-step process, from Arabic to a vernacular to Latin, was how the vast treasury of knowledge finally became accessible to the Latin literate scholars of Europe. The Jewish diaspora, therefore, did not just carry the flame, they built the final, essential bridge. They took the enriched knowledge of the Greco-Islamic world and, through their unique position and skills, delivered it directly into the hands of a European audience that was desperately hungry for it, setting the stage for an intellectual rebirth that would change the world. A military conquest became an intellectual surrender. When King Alfonso VI of Castile marched into Toledo in 1085, his knights expected to find a prize of land and power. What they discovered instead was a civilization whose knowledge made their own world seem primitive. The libraries of this city, which had been a flourishing center of Islamic and Jewish learning for centuries, were filled with books containing ideas that had been lost to Christian Europe for almost 1,000 years. The new Christian rulers, far from burning these texts as heretical, made a decision of breathtaking historical importance. They chose to learn from the conquered. The real treasure of Toledo was not in its treasury but in its scriptoriums. Under the visionary patronage of Archbishop Raymond, a formal institution was established, the Toledo School of Translators. Its mission was monumental: to systematically channel this vast ocean of Arabic knowledge into the Latin stream of European thought. This was not a task for a single scholar, but for a collaborative, multilingual assembly. A typical translation team might include a Jewish scholar, fluent in Arabic and the local Romance tongue, who would read the Arabic text aloud and translate it into spoken Spanish. A Mozarabic Christian, a descendant of Christians who had lived under Muslim rule, might then refine the Spanish version, which a Latin-speaking cleric would finally transcribe into the formal written language of the Church and the Academy. It was a linguistic assembly line for ideas, and it worked with stunning efficiency. The most prolific of these intellectual laborers was Gerard of Cremona. Driven by a thirst for knowledge he could not find in Italy, he traveled to Toledo specifically to access its libraries. He spent decades there, translating at least 71 major works single-handedly. Through his pen, Europe first received Ptolemy's Almagest, the work that mapped the heavens with geometric precision, and Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the medical encyclopedia that would become the foundation of European medicine for centuries. Gerard was not alone. A flood of texts poured into Europe, the complete works of Aristotle on logic and natural science, the advanced algebra of Al-Khwarizmi, the philosophical commentaries of Averroes. This was not a trickle of new ideas, it was a dam break. A continent that had been intellectually starved was suddenly presented with a feast. This torrent of new-old knowledge created a cognitive revolution. European scholars who had been meticulously studying a handful of ancient texts for generations were suddenly handed a library that contained the entire intellectual inheritance of the classical world, plus 1,000 years of commentary, critique, and groundbreaking advancement from the Islamic world. They had to build entirely new institutions just to manage this explosion of information, and so they did. The first universities began to appear in Bologna, in Paris, in Oxford, not as isolated accidents, but as a direct response to this overwhelming influx of texts that demanded to be studied, debated, and understood. The lecture halls of these new universities were built with the very stones of the translated knowledge from Toledo. The fall of one city had unlocked the mind of a continent. The sheer weight of all this new knowledge demanded a new kind of vessel. Cathedral schools designed for training clerics were suddenly swamped with texts on Aristotle's physics, Islamic medicine, and advanced mathematics. They simply could not handle the flood. The solution emerged not from a king's decree, but from the bottom up, from the students and masters themselves. They began to form a universitas, a term that originally meant nothing more than a guild or a corporation. This was the birth of the university, and it was a revolution in organizing human thought. In Bologna, it was a guild of students who banded together to hire professors and set tuition rates, protecting themselves from exploitation. In Paris, it was a guild of masters who united to control who was qualified to teach, creating the very first teaching licenses. These licenses, these official permissions to lecture, were the origin of our modern degrees, the bachelor's, master's, and doctorate. They were a quality control system for a sudden explosion of information. The university provided something the ancient Library of Alexandria never had: institutional permanence. A single library could burn, but a corporation of learned men spread across Europe was virtually indestructible. This new structure created a standardized curriculum, a set course of study that every serious scholar would follow. At its heart was a revolutionary teaching method, the disputation. Imagine a classroom not as a place for passive listening, but as an intellectual battleground. A master would pose a question, such as whether the world was eternal or created. Students would then use the logical tools of Aristotle, recently translated from Arabic commentaries, to argue for and against the proposition. This was not rote memorization. It was a dynamic, rigorous process of testing every idea against reason and counter-argument. It trained a generation of thinkers to engage critically with the very texts they were preserving. This entire system, from the licensed masters to the formal debates, was fundamentally designed to manage the colossal inheritance from Toledo and Baghdad. The university became the permanent, secure home for the Alexandrian legacy. It was the final link in the chain, the place where knowledge was not just stored, but systematically challenged, refined, and passed on to the next generation with guaranteed continuity. The lone scholar in his cell was replaced by a resilient, self-perpetuating community of inquiry. The flickering torch carried for 1,000 years was finally placed in a lantern that would never go out. So this new curriculum was built around a startlingly simple yet profound structure. All students began with the trivium, the threefold path of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. This was not about memorizing grammar rules for their own sake. Grammar taught you how language constructs reality. Rhetoric taught you how to persuade others of that reality. And logic, the crown jewel of the trivium, armed you with the tools to test every statement for its truth. It was a training program for the mind itself. Once your mind was sharpened by the trivium, you advanced to the quadrivium, the fourfold path of number, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was the mathematical study of the cosmos. Arithmetic was the pure theory of number. Geometry was number in space, music was number in time, and astronomy was number in motion in the heavens. This entire educational ladder was designed to produce a person who could reason clearly about anything. And at the very heart of it all, pulsing like a steady drumbeat, was the newly recovered Aristotle. For centuries, Europe had only known his works on logic, the organon. But the translations from Toledo and elsewhere delivered a shock to the system, the rest of his monumental library. Suddenly, scholars had Aristotle's physics, which laid out a rational explanation for motion and change in the natural world. They had his metaphysics, which asked profound questions about the nature of being and existence itself. They had his ethics and his politics, which provided a blueprint for human virtue and social order based not on divine revelation, but on human reason and observation. This was not just a new book, it was a complete, self-contained system for understanding everything from a falling stone to a just king. Here was a pagan philosopher who had seemingly constructed a perfect model of the universe using logic alone. The initial reaction from the church was one of sheer panic. How could this comprehensive system, which had no mention of Christian salvation or a creator God, be reconciled with the teachings of the faith? At the University of Paris, the authorities repeatedly banned the teaching of Aristotle's natural philosophy. They saw it as a direct threat, but you cannot unread a book that compelling. The ideas were too powerful to simply suppress. The solution, therefore, was not to destroy Aristotle, but to baptize him. This monumental task fell to a quiet, methodical Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas. In his masterwork, the Summa Theologica, Aquinas performed one of the most ambitious intellectual syntheses in history. He argued that faith and reason were not enemies. They were two different paths leading to the same ultimate truth, God. Aristotle's reason could brilliantly explain the natural world, the world of our senses. Divine revelation through Scripture explained the supernatural world of grace and salvation. One did not contradict the other, they complemented each other. Aquinas used Aristotle's own logical methods to prove the existence of God, framing them as 5 rational arguments accessible to any thinking person. He took Aristotle's concept of virtue and wove it into a Christian framework of divinely inspired moral law. In doing so, Aquinas made Aristotle safe for the church and indispensable for the university. The Aristotelian system, now fused with Christian theology, became the official foundation of the entire curriculum. The lecture halls echoed with his concepts. The disputations tested his logic. The entire degree system was a process of mastering his works. The journey of 1,000 years from the scriptoriums of Alexandria to the translation teams of Toledo culminated in the mind of a single scholar in a 13th century classroom, debating the nature of reality using tools forged in ancient Greece, preserved in Baghdad, and delivered back to a Europe reborn. The chain was now complete, and it had built its own permanent home. Yet even as the great universities rose, their foundations rested upon a far quieter, older tradition of preservation. For centuries, the only light of learning burning in Western Europe was the single candle of a monk in his scriptorium. These monastic communities became the unsung, indispensable guardians of the written word during an age of profound fragmentation. While cities crumbled and empires dissolved into local fiefdoms, the rhythm of monastic life remained unbroken, centered around a sacred duty, ora et labora, prayer and work. And one of the most vital forms of this labor was copying. In the hushed, austere rooms known as scriptoria, rows of monks would spend their daylight hours in a state of intense, silent concentration. Their work was an act of devotion, a physical prayer written in ink. Each manuscript was a monumental investment of time and skill. A single Bible could take a team of scribes an entire year to complete. The process was grueling. They had to carefully prepare the parchment from animal skins, mix their own inks, and then copy every single letter by hand, striving for perfect uniformity in their script, all by the light of a narrow window or a flickering lamp. Their primary mission was, of course, to copy the scriptures and the writings of the Church Fathers, but in doing so, they also preserved the last surviving fragments of classical Latin learning that had survived the collapse of the Roman world. While the advanced Greek science of Alexandria was gone from the West, works by Latin authors were saved from total oblivion by this patient, unglamorous work. A Roman statesman like Boethius, who had translated parts of Aristotle's logic before his execution, was kept alive in these monastic libraries. The vast natural encyclopedia of Pliny the Elder, a compilation of all Roman knowledge about the world, survived only because monks faithfully copied it generation after generation. This was not a dynamic, creative intellectual culture like Baghdad. It was an act of sheer, stubborn preservation. These monks were not debating Aristotle's metaphysics. They were ensuring that the very words of the past, the foundational texts of their own civilization, were not lost to the coming centuries. They were creating a permanent, distributed backup of knowledge across thousands of monasteries from Ireland to Italy. If a single library was destroyed by Viking raiders or in a local fire, the odds were high that an identical copy of its most important text existed in a monastery 100 miles away. This network of scriptoria provided the crucial baseline of literacy and the repository of classical Latin texts that would later prove essential. When the flood of translations from the Arabic world began pouring into Europe from Toledo, scholars suddenly had a benchmark. They could now take a Latin text of Pliny that had been preserved in a French monastery for 500 years and compare it to an Arabic translation of the same Greek source that had come through Baghdad. They could see where the Latin tradition was incomplete or corrupted, and they could use the newly recovered Arabic versions to fill in the gaps. The monastic scribes, in their silent dedication, had held one end of the chain during its most fragile, attenuated period. They proved that the first and most fundamental intellectual act is not creation, but simple, steadfast preservation, ensuring that there is something left for the next generation to build upon. This intellectual engine had a name, Scholasticism, and its primary fuel was a fierce, formalized debate known as the Disputatio. Picture a crowded lecture hall, not with students passively taking notes, but as a theater of the mind. A master would pose a question that cut to the core of understanding, a question like, can God's infinite power create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it? The room would then divide. One student would argue the case for the sick, drawing upon the absolute authority of the Bible, the writings of a church father like Augustine, and the logical framework of Aristotle. Another student would then argue the case against the non, using those very same authorities to build a contradictory case. pointing out every apparent flaw and inconsistency. This was not a shouting match. It was a meticulous, step-by-step application of logic, a verbal chess game where every move had to follow the strict rules of reason recovered from those ancient Greek and Arabic texts. The goal was not to win the argument for its own sake, but to arrive at a deeper truth, a resolution that could reconcile the contradiction. This entire method was pioneered a century before the universities became formalized by a brilliant and controversial teacher named Peter Abelard. In his explosive book, Sic et Non, meaning yes and no, he did something that was considered radical at the time. He compiled a list of over 150 theological questions, and under each one, he placed direct quotes from the Bible and the Church Fathers that seemed to completely contradict each other. He did not provide the answers. His purpose was to force his students to do the work themselves, to use their own reason to untangle the knot. He was teaching them how to think, not what to think. This was the ultimate expression of the new learning. The Disputation trained an entire generation to engage with authority critically, not blindly. It insisted that even sacred texts had to be subjected to the clarifying light of logic. The scholars in these halls believed that God had given humanity two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and since both were divine creations, they could not ultimately contradict each other. Any apparent conflict was a failure of human understanding, a puzzle to be solved through rigorous intellectual effort. This was not dry, sterile debate as it is sometimes caricatured. It was a powerful, dynamic engine for truth-seeking, a system that took the vast and sometimes conflicting inheritance from Alexandria, Baghdad, and Toledo and refused to accept it passively. It demanded that every idea earn its place through the fire of questioning, forging a mindset of critical inquiry that would become the bedrock of all modern science and scholarship. The ideas themselves were weightless, but they needed a body to travel through time. That body was the book, and its physical form evolved dramatically to meet the demands of the new knowledge. In the great Library of Alexandria, wisdom was stored on scrolls, majestic but impractical. To find a single passage, you had to carefully unroll the entire lengthy document. It was a sequential medium, perfect for a continuous narrative but ill-suited for the kind of rapid cross-referencing and intense study that the university curriculum demanded. The revolution came with the codex, the simple, bound book as we know it. With pages you could flip, the codex allowed for random access. A scholar could now jump from the index to a specific chapter, compare a quote on page 50 with an argument on page 300, and hold multiple open texts on a single desk. This was not just a change in format, it was a change in how the human mind could interact with information. The book became a tool for active, nonlinear thought. Yet, producing these books by hand was excruciatingly slow and prohibitively expensive. A single copy of a major work like Aristotle's Physics could cost a fortune, placing it far beyond the reach of an average student. The medieval university, facing this crisis of access, engineered a brilliant solution, the Pecia system. In university towns like Paris and Bologna, official stationers held a master copy of a required text, one that had been certified by the university as accurate. This master copy was not lent out whole. Instead, it was disassembled into separate sections or Peciae. A student too poor to buy a complete book could go to the stationer and rent just one section at a time. They would then take this rented section to a professional scribe who would quickly copy it. Once that section was returned, the student would rent the next one, slowly building their own complete textbook, piece by affordable piece. This was an almost industrial, assembly line approach to knowledge reproduction. It meant that dozens of students in a single lecture hall could all be working from accurate, identical copies of Avicenna's canon or Peter Lombard's sentences, a feat that would have been unimaginable just a century before. The Pecia system democratized the very tools of learning, transforming the book from a rare treasure for the elite into a standard piece of equipment for the scholar. The chain of knowledge was no longer just an idea. It was a physical object copied and recopied by thousands of hands. Its pages literally passed from one student to the next, ensuring that the fire of Alexandria could be lit in the mind of anyone with the will to learn. A physician in 11th century Europe inherited a world of brutal guesswork. His tools were ancient folk remedies, superstitions about bodily fluids, and a profound ignorance of human anatomy. But within a single generation, his entire profession was transformed. The key that unlocked this revolution was a single, portable library of medical texts known as the Articella, or the Little Art of Medicine. This collection, newly translated from Arabic and Greek, became the foundational textbook for the first formal medical schools in Salerno and Montpellier. Suddenly, a student could open a single volume and find the complete works of the Greek master Galen, whose theories on anatomy and the four humors had been lost to the West for centuries. They could study the monumental canon of medicine by Avicenna, a systematic encyclopedia that organized every known disease and its treatment, and they could learn sophisticated surgical techniques from the detailed diagrams of Almagest. This was not just new information, it was an entirely new system for understanding the human body. Gone were the days of relying solely on local herb women or prayer. The Articella introduced a complex logical framework called humoral theory. It proposed that health was a delicate balance of four fluids within the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess or deficiency of any one humor caused disease. This might sound strange to us now, but for the first time, it gave physicians a rational, systematic model to explain why people got sick and how to make them well. It moved medicine from a collection of random practices into a coherent, teachable science. The university medical faculty took this new knowledge and built a fortress of authority around it. They established a rigorous course of study that could last a decade, culminating in formal examinations and a licensed degree. This licensing process was a direct response to the flood of new, complex information. How could you trust a man to set a bone or prescribe a powerful drug if he had not proven his mastery of Galen and Avicenna? The chain of knowledge had not only delivered the texts, it had created the very concept of the professional, university-trained physician. His authority no longer came from his bedside manner or family tradition, but from his mastery of a written tradition that stretched in an unbroken line through Baghdad and Alexandria, all the way back to the ancient world. The healer had become a scholar, and his classroom was the first link in a chain of care that would eventually stretch for 1,000 years into the future. A merchant in a crowded Italian marketplace stares at a column of Roman numerals, his stylus scratching slowly at the wax tablet. To calculate a simple profit, he must navigate a clumsy sea of letters where M is 1,000 and X is 10. Meanwhile, in a dusty library in Baghdad centuries earlier, another scholar, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, had already solved this problem with an elegant new language, one built not on letters representing fixed numbers, but on symbols representing unknown quantities. His book, the Kitab Algebra, was a quiet detonation in the history of thought. Its title, meaning the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, gave the world the word algebra. But this was far more than a new set of equations. It was a fundamental shift from calculating specific answers to solving entire classes of problems. Al-Khwarizmi was not merely finding a number, he was creating a method to find any number by abstracting the problem itself. He would take a practical issue of inheritance, like dividing an estate, and strip it down to its bare mathematical bones, calling the unknown quantity a thing, or in Arabic, a shay. This act of naming the unknown was itself a revolution. It allowed complex real-world puzzles to be translated into a universal script of symbols that could then be manipulated according to set rules, rules of balancing and completing, to arrive at a solution. This systematic approach to linear and quadratic equations provided a skeleton key for countless locks, yet his genius delivered a second, equally powerful tool to the world. In another work, he meticulously described the Hindu numeral system, which we now call Arabic numerals. He championed the decimal positional system and the concept of zero, a symbol for nothing that made calculating everything infinitely easier. Just imagine the liberation of replacing the clumsy Roman numeral mmdccxlix with 2749. This was not just a new way to write numbers. It was a new way to think with them. When these twin innovations, algebra and the new numerals, finally reached Europe through Latin translation, their impact was slow but seismic. An Italian merchant's son, Leonardo Fibonacci, encountered them in North Africa and recognized their power instantly. His book, Liber Abaci, became the evangelizing text for this new math, showing merchants how these methods could transform accounting, calculate profit, and convert currencies with a speed and accuracy that were previously unimaginable. The abacus, the counting board that had defined commerce for centuries, began to seem obsolete. This was more than a convenience. It was the birth of a new intellectual infrastructure. The recovery of this mathematical toolkit, refined in the Islamic world from Greek geometry and Indian numerals, provided the essential vocabulary for the universe. It gave astronomers the language to chart planetary motion with precision. It gave engineers the formulas to calculate thrust and load for their cathedrals and machines. The chain of knowledge had delivered more than preserved wisdom. It had delivered a new operating system for the human mind, one that would soon allow a revolution not just in calculation, but in comprehending the very mechanics of nature. The night sky above medieval Europe was a canvas for mythology, a shifting tapestry of divine signs and portents. Then came a book that transformed those wandering lights into a clockwork of breathtaking precision. Ptolemy's Almagest, translated from Arabic into Latin in Toledo, was not merely a new text. It was an entire intellectual universe delivered in a single volume. For the first time in centuries, European scholars held a complete mathematical system for predicting the movements of the planets with stunning accuracy. It could forecast a lunar eclipse to the hour or plot the retrograde motion of Mars years in advance. This was a power that felt almost divine, yet it was born from pure geometry and relentless observation. The cosmos was no longer a mystery. It was a puzzle that had been solved. At the heart of the Almagest was its famous geocentric model, a complex dance of circles upon circles known as epicycles and deferents, all centered on a stationary Earth. While we now know this model was fundamentally wrong about the Sun's place, its real revolution was not its answer but its method. Ptolemy demonstrated that the chaotic appearing heavens could be tamed by mathematics. He provided a logical, testable framework, proving that the universe was not arbitrary. It obeyed rules that the human mind could decipher. This methodological rigor was the book's true and enduring legacy. Islamic astronomers had been the crucial curators of this masterpiece. Scholars in places like the Maraghe Observatory did not just preserve the Almagest. They tested its predictions against centuries of their own meticulous observations. They refined its calculations, built more precise instruments, and even proposed subtle adjustments to its models. When Gerard of Cremona translated the text in Toledo, he was not delivering a dusty relic. He was handing Europe a living, breathing scientific tradition, polished to a high gloss. Instantly, the Almagest became the absolute cornerstone of the university curriculum in astronomy. To master the quadrivium was to master Ptolemy. Students spent years grappling with its geometric proofs and complex tables. The entire educational project was, in a way, a centuries-long conversation with this single text. This engagement created a profound paradox. By teaching an entire generation of scholars to think with Ptolemy's rigorous mathematical logic, the universities ultimately produced the minds that would dismantle his Earth-centered universe. You cannot challenge a system you do not thoroughly understand. The deep familiarity with the Almagest's strengths and its lingering imperfections is what fueled the quest for a better model. The chain of knowledge had delivered a perfect, self-contained system whose greatest gift was inspiring its own overthrow. A single, forbidden question could unravel the entire tapestry of medieval thought. What if the world was eternal, with no moment of divine creation? What if the human soul was not a unique, immortal spirit, but a function of the body that perished with it? These were not idle speculations. They were the logical conclusions drawn from the newly recovered works of Aristotle and the razor-sharp commentaries of the Islamic philosopher Averroes, and they landed in the lecture halls of Paris like a lit fuse. For the first time, scholars possessed a complete, rational system for explaining the natural world that seemed to operate entirely without the need for a Christian God. The authority of the Church, which had just begun to feel secure in its newly built universities, was suddenly staring into an abyss of its own making. The crisis came to a head in 1277 when the Bishop of Paris, Stephen Tempier, issued a sweeping condemnation. He forbade the teaching of 219 specific philosophical propositions, a list so comprehensive it read like a syllabus for intellectual rebellion. It was an act of sheer panic, a desperate attempt to build a wall around doctrine before reason washed it all away. You were no longer allowed to suggest that God could not create multiple worlds, or that the stars influenced human will, or that theological truths could be false in philosophy. The penalty for defiance was excommunication, a spiritual and professional death sentence for any master. Yet, this attempt to silence debate had the exact opposite effect. By so meticulously listing every dangerous idea, the condemnation did not erase them. It gave them a name and a shape, broadcasting them to every curious mind in Europe. Now, every scholar knew precisely what the most radical arguments were. The ban created a shadow curriculum, a set of thrilling, forbidden thoughts that demanded to be grappled with. This official pressure forced the greatest minds of the age to do more than just reject Aristotle. They had to conquer him. They had to enter the arena of his logic and defeat him on his own terms. The result was not a retreat into simple faith, but an astonishing leap forward in philosophical sophistication. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas, who himself had some propositions condemned, were forced to build even more robust and intricate systems to reconcile reason and revelation. They had to prove that an eternal world was logically possible for an omnipotent God, even if Scripture said otherwise. They had to construct airtight arguments for the soul's immortality using the very Aristotelian principles that seemed to deny it. The conflict between the bishop's decree and the philosopher's texts became the forge that tempered Western intellectual life. This was not the end of the journey for the chain of knowledge. It was the moment the chain was pulled taut, testing its strength and proving it could hold under the weight of the most profound questions a civilization could ask of itself. The fragile work of scholars required a fortress of gold and power to protect it. While students debated in lecture halls and scribes hunched over their desks, a different kind of sponsor was making the entire intellectual enterprise possible. The transmission of knowledge was a staggeringly expensive endeavor, and its ultimate guardians were often popes, kings, and emperors who saw its immense strategic value. In the sun-baked kingdom of Sicily, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II earned his nickname, the Wonder of the World, for his insatiable curiosity. He actively recruited Jewish and Islamic scholars to his court, engaging them in direct debate and commissioning translations of Arabic texts on falconry and philosophy. He did not just fund learning, he immersed himself in it, using his royal authority to bridge cultural divides. Further west in Castile, King Alfonso X took this patronage to an industrial scale. He assembled teams of translators in Toledo and beyond, tasking them with rendering the great works of astronomy and law into the vernacular Castilian language. His most famous commission was the Alphonsine Tables, a set of astronomical charts so precise they refined Ptolemy's own models and were used by navigators for centuries. Even the papacy, despite its deep suspicion of some Aristotelian ideas, became a crucial patron. Popes established endowed chairs at universities, granting them official papal bulls that guaranteed their rights and independence. They founded and stocked great libraries, understanding that a unified Christendom needed a unified, educated elite to administer it. This sponsorship was never purely altruistic. For a ruler like Frederick, it demonstrated his sophistication and power, outshining his rivals. For Alfonso, it created a corps of legally trained administrators who could run his kingdom more efficiently. For the Pope, it centralized intellectual authority under the umbrella of the Church. The chain of knowledge woven by scholars was plated with the gold of princes who understood that the greatest power of all was the power to define reality itself. A single language became the golden thread stitching together the European mind, while the source texts arrived in a dizzying array of tongues, from the philosophical Greek of Aristotle to the technical Arabic of Al-Khwarizmi. They all converged upon a single destination language, Latin. This was not the classical Latin of Cicero, but a vibrant, evolving scholarly dialect, precise enough to handle the geometry of Euclid and the medical diagnoses of Avicenna. The translators in Toledo and Sicily were not just moving words from one script to another. They were building a new lexicon, coining terms and refining phrases to capture concepts that had never before needed expression in the language of the Roman Church. This act of linguistic creation forged a universal intellectual currency. A student arriving at the University of Paris from a rural English village and another coming from a German town might struggle to understand each other's native dialects. But in the lecture hall they were equals. They could open their copied Pecia of Gerard of Cremona's translation and find the exact same Latin sentence explaining the motion of the stars. They could attend a disputation in Paris and then travel to Bologna or Prague, walking into a new classroom and immediately understanding the debate, because the entire framework of logic, the very vocabulary of reason, was identical. This shared language created a true commonwealth of learning that transcended kingdoms and local customs. It meant a groundbreaking idea about logic from Oxford could be debated in Italy within a year, its nuances perfectly intact. It meant a medical innovation from Salerno could be adopted in Denmark without losing a drop of its meaning. The Latin language became the operating system for the entire university network, a protocol that allowed thousands of individual minds to function as a single, continent-spanning intelligence. The chain of knowledge, carried for centuries by countless hands, was finally given a voice that everyone could understand. The book was too precious to be left alone. In the earliest university libraries, you would find the most important volumes physically chained to their reading desks, a heavy iron lock securing wisdom against theft. This was not an act of distrust but of profound necessity. A single copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics or Avicenna's Canon represented a fortune in labor and materials, a treasure more valuable than most buildings. These chained libraries were the first cautious step in rebuilding the Alexandrian dream, but they proved the system was working. Knowledge was now so vital to the university's function that it had to be protected, yet made accessible to the scholars who needed it. As the Pecia system and professional scribes steadily increased the number of books in circulation, a new institution could emerge, the university library itself. This was no longer a private collection for a king or a pope, but a corporate asset owned by the Guild of Masters. Its mission was systematic and practical, to acquire, copy, and catalog the essential texts of the curriculum. A student at the University of Paris could now walk into a library and find not just one chained copy of Peter Lombard's Sentences, but multiple copies, along with the key commentaries and disputations that had grown up around it. The library became a living, expanding record of an ongoing intellectual conversation. It collected not only the foundational texts from Toledo and Baghdad, but also the new summi, the lecture notes, and the records of debates generated by the university's own masters. This transformed the ideal of Alexandria from a fantasy of totality into a functional reality of sufficiency. The goal was not to have every book ever written, but to have every book necessary for the work at hand, the work of teaching and learning. The centralized repository was reborn, not in one glorious building, but in a distributed network of libraries from Oxford to Prague, each one a node in a web of knowledge that no single fire could ever destroy. The monarch's private dream had finally become the scholar's public workshop. A single invention in the mid-1400s turned a chain into a web. The printing press with movable type did not just speed up the process of copying books, it fundamentally altered the very architecture of knowledge. For over 1,000 years, the chain had been a fragile, linear sequence, a single torch passed from one pair of hands to the next. Now that torch was shattered into 1,000,000 sparks, all flying at once. A text that would have occupied a monk for an entire year in a scriptorium could be reproduced by a printing shop in a matter of days. The cost of a book plummeted. Where once a single volume of Aristotle was a treasure locked to a library desk, now a student could own one, a merchant could own one, even an ambitious farmer with a thirst for learning could eventually afford one. This was the great democratization of the intellect. The university's monopoly on advanced texts was broken forever. The first books to roll off these new presses were not popular novels, but the very core of the recovered canon. The works of Aristotle, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas, the complex commentaries of the medieval scholastics, these were the early bestsellers of print. Their ideas, once debated by a small elite in a handful of cities, were now cemented as the foundation of Western thought, available for anyone with the will to read. The slow, careful carrying of the torch was over. It was replaced by a brilliant, widespread flash of light that ignited public debate on an unimaginable scale, setting the stage for the revolutions in religion and science that would soon reshape the world. The chain was complete, but its true work was only just beginning. Our story has followed the chain west, but the light of Alexandria burned in other lamps as well. While Europe was reassembling its inheritance from Arabic translations, the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople was living in a continuous conversation with the Greek originals. Its libraries and monasteries safeguarded the actual, unmediated texts of Plato and Aristotle, a living tradition that had never been broken. For 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, Constantinople was a fortress of Hellenic thought, though its focus often remained within the elite circles of the court and the church, less a dynamic engine of new ideas and more a magnificent, well-guarded treasury. This changed with a single, catastrophic event, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The city's fall sent a wave of Greek-speaking scholars fleeing for their lives, carrying with them their most precious cargo, precious manuscripts of classical texts that Western Europe had never seen. Their arrival in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice was an electric shock to the nascent Renaissance. For the first time, humanist scholars could compare their medieval Latin translations of Aristotle with the original Greek. They discovered nuances and depths that had been lost in the double translation from Greek to Arabic to Latin. This direct contact with the source code of classical thought ignited a new level of philological and philosophical fervor, proving that the chain had not one path, but many. Meanwhile, knowledge was also traveling in the other direction. The same Silk Road networks that carried spices westward also carried ideas eastward into India and China. Greek astronomical and medical concepts filtered through Persian and Islamic scholarship, found audiences in Indian courts, and even influenced Chinese cartography and calendar science. A Greek medical text might be translated into Sanskrit, while Indian numerals and mathematical concepts made their way back to Baghdad. The impact in the East was profound, yet it integrated into existing, sophisticated intellectual traditions, creating unique syntheses rather than causing the kind of disruptive revolution it had in the West. This global perspective is a crucial correction. The survival of ancient knowledge was never guaranteed by a single thread. It was a fragmented, worldwide effort. The Byzantine Greeks, the Islamic scholars of Baghdad, the Jewish translators of Spain, and the merchants of the Silk Road all acted as separate, redundant centers of preservation. If one link had shattered completely, others remained to carry the flame. The story of how our modern world came to know Aristotle and Euclid is not a simple westward march. It is the story of a great, scattered family, each branch protecting a part of the legacy, ensuring that no single disaster could ever again erase the memory of Alexandria. The quiet disputations of the medieval university classroom contained the seeds of a cosmic upheaval. A Polish cleric named Nicolaus Copernicus, educated at the universities of Krakow and Bologna, did not look at the night sky with fresh eyes. He looked at it with a mind superbly trained in the very tools the chain of knowledge had delivered. He knew Ptolemy's Almagest intimately, its brilliant geometry and its nagging imperfections. His revolutionary idea that the sun and not the earth was the center of the cosmos was not a bolt from the blue. It was the product of a scholar using recovered Greek texts, Islamic mathematical models, and the scholastic habit of questioning authority to solve a problem that had troubled astronomers for centuries. He stood directly on the platform built by 1,000 years of preservation. Galileo Galilei, a university professor himself, wielded the language of mathematics like a weapon. That language, algebra and the decimal system, was a direct inheritance from Al-Khwarizmi and the translators of Toledo. When he pointed his telescope at the moons of Jupiter, he was not just collecting new data. He was applying a quantitative, logical framework to the heavens, a framework that had been meticulously reassembled within the university walls. His famous conflicts with the church were, in essence, a disputatio on a global stage, a dramatic continuation of the same medieval debate over whether reason or scripture held the final key to nature's secrets. Then came Isaac Newton, who famously admitted he saw further by standing on the shoulders of giants. Those giants were not only the ancients. They were the long line of scholastic philosophers who had honed the methods of logical analysis, the Islamic astronomers who had refined celestial mechanics, and the medieval masters who had made the intensive study of Aristotle's natural world the core of higher education. Newton's monumental Principia Mathematica is unthinkable without the prior existence of the university system. Its mathematical proofs, its logical structure, and its very ambition to explain the cosmos with universal laws are the ultimate flowering of the seed planted in Alexandria. The so-called scientific revolution was not a rebellion against the past. It was the past's greatest and most logical conclusion. The slow, patient work of the chain had not merely saved a collection of old books. It had built an intellectual launchpad, and from that platform, the human mind finally took flight. The term Dark Ages is a lie told by winners. Renaissance scholars, eager to glorify their own rebirth, painted the 1,000 years before them as a time of ignorance and superstition. But our journey through the chain of knowledge reveals a far different truth. This was not an era of darkness, it was an era of keepers. The flame of classical learning was never snuffed out. It was sheltered in the quiet scriptoria of monasteries, fanned into a brilliant blaze in the libraries of Baghdad, and then carried across continents to be permanently housed in the stone halls of universities. This period was not a void, it was a bridge, a long and patient labor of preservation that made the modern world possible. Think of a relay race run not for a few minutes but for 1,000 years. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of the race. It was simply the moment the baton was passed, from the senatorial class to the monastic scribe, from the Greek philosopher to the Syrian translator, from the Islamic polymath to the Jewish scholar. Each hand that held that baton ensured its survival. The so-called Dark Ages were, in fact, the critical incubation period for the very ideas that would later explode in the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. To call this time dark is to ignore the countless candles burning in thousands of rooms where men were not destroying knowledge, but were dedicating their lives to copying it, translating it, and building the first institutions designed to protect it forever. The light was never gone, it was just being carefully gathered and guarded, waiting for the world to be ready for its return. That corporate guild of masters and students, born from a crisis of information, still defines the very shape of your own education. When you choose a major, you are selecting a faculty, a division of learning that traces straight back to the medieval separation of law, medicine, theology, and the arts. The degree you pursue, whether a bachelor's or a doctorate, is a direct echo of the licenses to teach granted in the streets of 12th century Paris and Bologna. These were not mere titles, they were a revolutionary system of quality control, a guarantee that the person explaining Aristotle's physics or Avicenna's medicine had survived the fire of rigorous examination and formal disputation. This structure created a professional scholarly class, an intellectual meritocracy where authority came from demonstrated mastery of a tradition, not just from noble birth or clerical rank. The lecture you sit through today, where a professor stands and delivers knowledge to a room of students, is the modern evolution of the medieval practice of reading, of lectio, where a master would read from an authoritative text and then explain its intricacies. The small seminar, where students debate and challenge each other, is the direct descendant of the Disputatio, that theatrical clash of logic designed to sharpen the mind against the hardest questions. But perhaps the most enduring and fragile inheritance is the concept of academic freedom, the very idea that a community of scholars should have the right to govern its own members, set its own curriculum, and pursue truth even when that truth is inconvenient to political or religious powers, was a hard-won medieval innovation. It established the university as a semi-independent republic of letters, a space for dangerous thoughts to be safely explored. This entire ecosystem, from the syllabus to the graduation ceremony, is a living fossil, a continuous tradition that has outlasted empires and survived every technological shift. The chain of knowledge did not just save old books, it built a machine for thinking, a resilient social technology that we have been using and refining for nearly 1,000 years. Your classroom is the great-grandchild of a scriptorium in Toledo, and your professor is the intellectual heir to a long line of translators, scribes, and masters who believed that some things are too important to be forgotten. The chain that carried the light of Alexandria is humanity's ultimate heirloom. It is a story not of a single library's fall, but of 1,000 rediscoveries. Not of one brilliant mind, but of countless translators and curators who chose to preserve rather than destroy. This legacy was forged in the quiet of monastic scriptoria, debated in the halls of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, and finally locked into the permanent curriculum of the medieval university. These were not accidents of history. They were deliberate choices made by generations who believed that the ideas of the past were a trust to be handed on to the future. Knowledge does not survive on its own. It is fragile. It needs protectors. It needs institutions built not for power or profit, but for the simple, profound duty of remembering. That is the true lesson of this 1,000-year journey. In our own era, where facts can feel fleeting and the very idea of truth is often challenged, this ancient chain offers a powerful reminder. The pursuit of understanding is a collective project that spans centuries. It connects a student in a modern lecture hall to a scribe in ancient Cordoba, and it depends on every one of us to keep the links strong. This history calls on us not just to learn, but to become curators ourselves, to value this incredible inheritance, and to contribute our own small part to the unbroken chain. If this journey through the resilience of ideas resonated with you, subscribe for more explorations of the forces that built our world. We would love to hear which part of this incredible story stood out to you most in the comments below.